At night in Phuoc Tuy province, the jungle didn't feel like a place. It felt like a mind, breathing, listening, remembering. The Viet Cong had grown up inside it. They knew which vines bled white sap and which thorns tore cloth like paper. They could tell from the angle of a broken reed whether a man was carrying rice or ammunition. They could smell foreigners too: soap, cigarettes, metal, the faint chemical bite of insect repellent that never quite beat the mosquitoes. For years, the Viet Cong had learned the sound of Americans. You heard them before you saw them: rotor blades chopping the air, artillery thumping somewhere beyond the horizon, radios clicking and chattering like insects made of metal. The Americans brought weight and noise and routine. You could prepare for them, you could hide, you could run, you could set your own traps because loud enemies are predictable enemies. But by 1966, something else had entered the green, something quieter than fear itself. The older cadre had a word for it. They said it with the casual superstition of men who had survived too long to mock their own instincts: Ma Rung, forest ghosts. Australia committed combat forces to support American operations in Vietnam, but it wasn't the number of Australians that changed the jungle's mood. It was the kind. The Special Air Service Regiment, still young enough to be underestimated, arrived with habits forged in Malaya and Borneo: small patrols, deep penetration, patience that bordered on cruelty. While American units built fire support bases and cleared landing zones, these men vanished into country where visibility dropped to meters and the terrain swallowed battalions whole. The Viet Cong believed they owned that jungle. They'd fought in it for decades. They knew every trail, every ambush point, every creek crossing, every patch of high ground that gave you a view, and every low hollow that turned into a death trap when the rain came. Or so they believed. The Australians didn't fight like other units. Their patrols could be 4 to 6 men, minimal radio, no nearby support. They moved like the jungle itself: patient, silent, lethal. They didn't hold territory, they didn't sweep. They hunted, and more than that, they watched. They treated violence like a tool, not a hobby. The Americans had helicopters and artillery always within reach. The Australians stripped everything away until only the essentials remained: skill, discipline, and the ability to become invisible. A courier named Hoa began to notice the difference before anyone put it into words. He was 19 and proud of how lightly he walked. The older men teased him, said he stepped like a cat, said he'd make a good scout. He carried messages wrapped in oilcloth, moved between hamlets and cache sites, knew the trails that wound like veins between rubber plantations and darker hills. One evening, he left at dusk with an escort, an older militiaman with a scar on his cheek and a habit of humming when he was nervous. Dusk was forgiving. Birds still made noise. The last light softened the world. Ho expected the usual threats: an American sweep, an ARVN patrol, the distant cough of a helicopter. Instead, the jungle fell quiet, as if something had stepped into the room. The militiaman stopped humming. They froze. Ho listened. Frogs, dripping leaves, his own pulse. Then the militiaman raised 2 fingers: danger, and pointed, not at a sound, but at a feeling. A patch of shadow beneath a fallen tree. Darkness that looked too deliberate. They backed away, slow enough to keep the leaves from speaking. They didn't see a man. They didn't hear a voice. They only felt the pressure of being observed. They didn't notice the thin wire near their feet because nothing exploded. The device was never meant to kill. It was a signal, an invisible trip of a line that told unseen men in unseen positions that something had moved through their net. A warning and a test. A week later, another courier didn't return. Then 2 militia scouts vanished from a trail everyone swore was safe. There were no firefights, no cratered earth, no shell casings to hold up as proof, only absence. By late 1966, the whispers had grown teeth. Some units began warning their men to be cautious in sectors patrolled by Australian reconnaissance elements. They described movements that were undetectable, ambushes without warning, an enemy that didn't reveal itself with radio chatter or noise. Men started volunteering for daylight movement. They moved in tighter groups. They argued about whether it was better to travel in silence or make noise on purpose, because noise, at least, was something you could control. But the Australians were quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Quiet meant anywhere. Somewhere around that time, Viet Cong soldiers began reporting something that didn't fit their experience of war. Patrols disappearing without contact, supply caches discovered and destroyed without warning, trails watched but the watchers never seen. The Viet Cong knew the Australians were there, but they couldn't locate them. And in guerrilla war, not knowing where the enemy is doesn't just create danger, it creates humiliation. In February 1967, 4 men from an SAS patrol moved on foot into enemy country with a simple task: locate and monitor a suspected base area. No helicopter insertion, no sudden roar of blades to announce them. They walked deep, tens of kilometers through terrain that punished speed. Their point man read the jungle like a book written in dirt and broken twigs, disturbed earth, a scuff mark in mud, a snapped branch that hadn't browned yet. He didn't track like a movie hero, he calculated probability. He built a picture from fragments. They moved for 6 hours and covered what most infantry would cover in 2. Not because they were weak, but because they were awake. The jungle is full of information if you're patient enough to see it. On the 3rd day, they became nothing. An observation position was not a bunker. It was the absence of a bunker. No cut branches, fires, no cleared ground, no obvious nest. Two men watched while two rested, rotating in silence. No talking, no smoking, no fire. Cold rations, hand signals only. The jungle's damp heat did the rest. For 48 hours, they watched a trail and the life around it. They counted fighters, noted defensive positions, marked where supplies were kept, identified who gave orders by watching who others looked at before moving. Each night, one brief radio transmission, whispered and coded, just enough to send the picture back. Airtime measured in minutes across days. At dawn, the strikes came. Brief, precise, the kind of violence meant to accomplish something specific rather than terrorize. Then it stopped, and by the time the Viet Cong searched the tree line, the Australians were already gone, moving to the next task as if nothing had happened. The searchers found nothing. No shell casings, no footprints, no obvious hide, just the unbearable sense that someone had been close enough to watch you breathe and you never knew. In April 1967, intelligence suggested regular supply movement along a trail. Rifles, rockets, mortar shells, documents moving south. A small patrol selected a position and waited. Waiting in the jungle isn't passive, it's work. It's muscle cramps you can't stretch. It's insects feeding on your skin and the refusal to slap them. It's controlling your breathing when your lungs want to cough. It's the discipline to remain less noticeable than a shadow. They held still through hours that felt longer than days. Ants crawled over uniforms, mosquitoes drank, sweat soaked everything and cooled into discomfort. At dusk on the second day, movement appeared. Men carrying loads, careful but not careful enough. The Australians let the column enter fully because they didn't just want casualties, they wanted certainty. Who was leading? Who carried papers? Who carried rockets? Then the jungle erupted for a moment. Short, controlled, violent enough to end the question instantly. The firefight wasn't a battle. It was an action measured in heartbeats. When it ended, the Australians did not linger. They took what mattered and vanished into the green. Reinforcements arrived later, sweeping and shouting, firing into shadows, furious at the idea that an enemy could come so close and leave nothing behind. Again, nothing. For the Viet Cong, that kind of enemy did something artillery couldn't do. It rewired the mind. Patrols became tentative. Soldiers hesitated on trails. Supply movement slowed because men demanded more security, more scouts, more caution. Even brave men can't operate smoothly when every step feels like stepping onto a stage where someone else controls the lights. Who heard the advice passed down in briefings, spoken more than written because paper can be captured. If you encounter Americans, you can fight or withdraw as the situation demands. If you encounter Australians, withdraw immediately. Do not engage. He tried to laugh along with the others, but his laughter sounded thin. One day, moving along a creek line, he found a mark carved into a tree, one of their own simple trail signs. He recognized the hand that cut it, he recognized the meaning, and he recognized something else, subtle and almost respectful. The mark had been altered, not destroyed. A shallow cut turned it into a different message. We were here. We saw you. We could have killed you. We didn't. He stood very still and felt, for the first time, what it meant not merely to fight an enemy, but to be evaluated by one. The Australians weren't just trying to kill, they were deciding when killing was worth the risk. That kind of control was poison to a guerrilla force that prided itself on owning the terms of contact. Later that year, Australian command needed current intelligence on a fortified area in the long high hills. Tunnels, bunkers, multiple defensive positions. Places like that couldn't be assaulted blind. You needed numbers, routes, weak points, timings. You needed the enemy's habits. So another patrol moved in. A helicopter insertion dropped them away from the target area, brief, fast, and then the aircraft was gone, leaving only the jungle's noise returning like breath after a held moment. The patrol disappeared into the green and took days to reach a position from which they could watch. The terrain was brutal. Vines tore clothing. Slopes forced them to climb on hands and knees. In the worst sections, they advanced at a crawl, not because they lacked strength, but because the jungle punished haste with sound and sound with death. When they reached high ground, they became invisible again. From concealment, they observed the camp as if it were a diagram. Fighters moving between bunkers, sentries changing positions, tunnel mouths disguised, patrol routes repeating with the unconscious comfort of men who believed they were safe. For 3 days, they watched and wrote the truth down in small notes. Numbers, directions, routines. At night, brief coded transmissions went out, minutes at most, then silence again. When the patrol withdrew, Viet Cong patrols passed within a stone's throw and saw nothing. The Australians moved away the same way they'd arrived, slowly, carefully, like smoke. 2 weeks later, Allied forces used that intelligence to plan operations with a precision that made the Viet Cong feel the jungle itself had turned traitor. Positions were struck where they were weak. Routes were chosen that avoided the obvious traps. Tunnels were pressured at points the defenders didn't expect. What unsettled the Viet Cong most wasn't losing a fight. They'd lost fights before and kept going. It was the realization that for days at a time, Australians could sit a few hundred meters away, counting everything, mapping everything, and the defenders would never know they were being watched. That wasn't fear of technology, it wasn't fear of numbers, it was fear of ghosts. The difference was not equipment, it was philosophy. The Americans operated within a framework of abundant resources: air support, artillery, extraction aircraft ready to appear when the radio called, larger teams for mutual support, more firepower, more gear, more noise. The Australians treated resources as a liability. They carried carried what they needed to survive and to see. A typical patrol might carry days of rations, enough ammunition to end a contact quickly, water purification, a radio, medical supplies. The rest was discipline. Every man was trained to navigate, to treat casualties, to operate the radio. They didn't specialize the way many American units did. They cross-trained for redundancy. Lose the radio operator, any man could become the radio operator. Lose the patrol commander, the second could take over without a conversation. In thick jungle, numbers become friction. More people means more movement, more noise, more heat, more chances for compromise. 4 well-trained men can move like a rumor. For the Viet Cong, who had invented modern guerrilla tactics, who had fought the French, the Japanese, the French again, meeting an enemy who adopted those tactics and sharpened them felt like a violation of identity. The hunters had become the hunted, and being hunted in your own terrain is a special kind of humiliation. Operations expanded into areas like Hat Dich, a dense base region where bunkers and trails and hidden camps made conventional sweeps feel blind. Larger units moved with caution, but the SAS treated it like familiar language. Slip in, watch, confirm, strike only when advantage was absolute, then disappear. One patrol moved through a mangrove section where mud sucked at boots and water stank of rot. Every step threatened a sound: squelch, slip, splash. So they timed movement with wind gusts, used the jungle's own noise as cover, and stopped more than they moved. They noticed a tripwire, cut it without tension, reset the trap in a different way, not as an instruction, not as a prank, but as a message that the ground was no longer private. Sometimes even the ghosts made mistakes: a scuffed branch, a snapped twig too loud, a tiny noise that, in the jungle, might as well be a flare. When compromise happened, the response wasn't cinematic bravado, it was cold survival. They did not stay to win a firefight. Their job was intelligence, and survival was the first condition of intelligence. They withdrew fast and controlled, covering each other, using terrain to slow pursuit, moving toward a pre-planned extraction point with the kind of focus that squeezes fear into something useful. Once, a helicopter arrived low and violent, blades chopping the canopy, and the patrol threw themselves aboard in practiced motion. As the aircraft lifted, one man looked down and saw nothing but green. Then figures burst from the tree line, rifles raised in frustration. Too late. 30 seconds. That was the margin between life and death. Through all of it, the legend kept growing on the other side. Viet Cong soldiers described Australians as shadows, as something not quite human. They used the nickname Ma Rung until it became a practical warning rather than a superstition. Men who once prided themselves on patience began to rush simply because staying still felt like waiting to be selected. And the Australians, when asked later about their superhuman reputation, often said the same thing. They were scared most of the time. Terror was normal when you were 4 men behind enemy lines, surrounded by hundreds. The difference was that they trained for that fear. They used it as fuel for alertness. Fear made you careful. Careful kept you alive. They endured things that don't fit into heroic storytelling: leeches in the groin, tropical ulcers eating into skin, dehydration, exhaustion, the constant pressure of listening. One man later described lying in an ambush position while driver ants swarmed over him, biting again and again, and he didn't move because a scratch could be the sound that ended everyone. When people tried to explain the Australians' impact in numbers, they usually missed the point. Yes, the casualty ratios were extraordinary for such a small force. Yes, the patrol count was enormous for the size of the regiment. But fear isn't arithmetic. The real effect was psychological. The Viet Cong were used to setting the pace, choosing when to fight, deciding when to vanish. The SAS reversed that. Suddenly, trails felt watched, camps felt porous, silence felt dangerous. By 1971, Australian forces withdrew and the SAS were gone. The war continued for years, the jungle continued to grow, and trails reclaimed themselves as if nothing had ever happened. Rust ate old wire, leaf litter swallowed old footprints, memory softened details and sharpened emotions. For Hoa, the disappearance of the Australians did not bring relief. It brought a different kind of cold. Fear, after a while, becomes order. You learn its rules, you learn how it moves, you learn what it usually does next. For years, the Australians had been terrifying, but they were a known terror. Move carefully, vary routes, assume you're watched, don't trust silence. When the Australians left, the jungle didn't become safe. It became unreadable again. New units came through, different accents, different habits. Some fought loud, some fought fast, some fought like men trying to prove something. And Hoa discovered with a strange bitterness that he almost missed the enemy he'd feared most, because at least the Australians had been consistent. They didn't kill for theater. They didn't stay to punish a village just to make a point. They struck when it mattered, and they left when it didn't. He hated himself for thinking that. He hated the thought even more when it proved useful. Years later, Vietnam changed around him in ways he never expected. New roads, new buildings, tourists carrying cameras where men once carried rifles. In the late 1990s, a cousin brought a strange story from the city. An Australian veteran was visiting. Not an official, not a politician, just a man who'd been there, who wanted to see the places again. again. Ho told himself he wouldn't go, then he went anyway. They met in a small cafe. The veteran looked nothing like the ghost in Hoa's memory. Broad-shouldered but softened by age, hands scarred, eyes with that distant focus of someone who had spent too much of his life scanning horizons. Two men from opposite sides of a war that had aged them both. They didn't shake hands at first. They sat. They looked at each other. The veteran's Vietnamese was poor, learned from phrasebooks and regret, but his meaning was clear. I was here, he said. I did things. Hoa stared at the man's hands and imagined those hands cutting wire in the dark, lifting mines, writing notes by dim light. After a long moment, Hoa said carefully, we feared you. The veteran nodded once, as if he'd expected that. We feared you too, he answered. You knew the jungle. We had to learn it fast. Ho's laugh came out sharp. You learned, he said. The veteran looked down at his tea. We trained, he corrected, and we were lucky. Luck matters more than people admit. That word, luck, made the myth smaller, not less dangerous, just more human. Hoa asked, did you ever see us? The veteran met his gaze. Sometimes, he said. Mostly, we heard you. Sometimes we smelled your cooking. Sometimes you walked past us and never knew. Hoa swallowed. And you could have killed us? Sometimes, the veteran admitted. But killing wasn't always the point. That was the strangest thing Hoa had ever heard from an enemy. In the war, everything had been about killing. Body counts, revenge, proof, territory. Yet here was a man saying death had been a tool, not a hunger. Hoa asked, why did you leave? The veteran shrugged, a gesture heavy with politics neither of them controlled. Our government decided, he said, and we were tired. Hoa looked out at motorbikes buzzing down a street that used to be dust and fear. We were tired too, he said. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't hostile. It was shared. Then the veteran said quietly, in the jungle, we weren't heroes. We were just trying to bring our mates home. Hoa understood that. He didn't forgive it, but he understood it. Because in his own bunker, under the same rain and mosquitoes, he'd wanted the same thing. They parted without friendship, without closure, without speeches. But walking home, Hoa realized something unsettling. The legend had been true in one way and false in another. The Australians had felt like ghosts because ghosts don't behave like normal men. Ghosts don't panic, ghosts don't rush. Ghosts don't waste motion, but ghosts also don't suffer. And those men had suffered plenty. They had endured the jungle by refusing to fight it loudly, by refusing to become bigger than the terrain, by becoming smaller than their fear. They weren't supernatural. They were disciplined enough to appear supernatural. That discipline was the real weapon, the thing that turned four men into a threat that slowed movements, fractured confidence, and made hardened guerrillas hesitate before stepping into their own darkness. Years later, Hoa's nephew asked him again, were they brave? Hoa finally found the cleanest answer he could give. They weren't braver than us, he said. They were quieter. And in that war, quiet was power. He paused, then added, almost reluctantly, and they respected the jungle. That's why the jungle helped them. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind like they were listening. And somewhere deep in the green, whether in Vietnam or only in memory, the forest ghosts kept moving, unseen and patient, reminding anyone who thinks they own the terrain of the oldest lesson the jungle teaches. The hunters can become the hunted, and the shadows don't care which flag you carry.